Okay, I'll now read the paper by Yasmina Raini, who couldn't make it to this conference. She actually was stuck in London after her first plane from the United States, and she really couldn't make it. So I've got here what seems to be a short summary of her paper in English, plus a very short translation I made into the French language. The paper itself is about the Mouvement des Indigènes de la République, which she calls in English MIR. Okay, so I'll refer to MIR for Mouvement des Indigènes de la République, which sounds fairly logical. The term indigène, typically translated as indigenous, designates, in the French historical context, a legal category for colonial subjects. When Houria Boutelja, who would become the movement's spokeswoman, decided to use the term in the Appel des Indigènes de la République, she meant to reappropriate a colonial label in order to name a condition of sub-citizenship. The geographical complement to MIR's assertion that immigrants are in fact colonial subjects, in turn, is that their neighborhoods, the banlieues, the cités, the quartiers populaires, plenty of French words in there, are colonies within the French metropole. It is this colonial geography that she engages with throughout this paper. As Bernot has shown in 2009, reactions to MIR in the French media and academy have been overwhelmingly hostile and dismissive. Scholars frequently identify an ethnicist or even racialist tendency in Mouvement des Indigènes de la République. For the purposes of this paper, Yasmina assumes as a theoretical basis that colonial geographic categories, metropole, colony, outpost, etc., functions as representations of space close to Henri Lefebvre's analysis of the production of space, i.e., conceptualized spaces that reflect a dominant order. In this context, when MIR designates metropolitan and colonized spaces, it identifies representations of space. MIR mobilizes its project of spatial transformation in turn through Lefebvre's complement to representations of space, representational spaces, which are defined as, I quote, sites of resistance, unquote, in which the environment represented in representations of space are appropriated and transformed. Yasmina draws MIR material primarily in her research from the Indigène website. MIR writes that its website serves as a platform for discussion from which should emerge, I quote, a dynamic harmony that reflects the image of what the party of the Indigène will be, polyphonic without being cacophonic, unquote. As a polyphonic reflection of Indigène society, the MIR website provides a detailed account of the perspectives and activities that reflect and produce its experiences and perceptions of space. So the goal of Yasmina's paper is pretty much to have a look or present a colonial geography in the way it is apprehended by MIR, in which colonization is mobilized through French state discipline and the consequent assertions of state sovereignty in the banlieues, and that in this framework, MIR attempts to decolonize the Republic by launching a redemptive takeover of metropolitan and colonial space that involves the transient displacement of the state. In order to do so, she focuses on the relationship between the colony, banlieue, and metropole, city center, in MIR's analysis, on how the borders between the two are established and how they are repeatedly transgressed. Ultimately, it should become clear that in redeploying categories of metropole and colony, MIR effectively undermines the myth of the untainted metropole, thereby offering a model of colonialism distinguished by a flexible and dynamic but existent geography. The movement does so not simply in positing the existence of colonies within a traditionally metropolitan space, but in presenting an image of the metropole-colony dynamic in which there is a constant spatial give and take occurring between the two, mostly mobilized through the body. In Lefebvrean terms, after Henri Lefebvre, this give and take takes place as the spatial conquest between representations of space and representational spaces transpires. as the colonial police attempt to reinstate state supremacy in the colony, i.e. as a state representation of space works to assert itself, and as MIR creates representational space in the metropole, in city centers and other Republican spaces. So then she had a look at the different marches being organized in the metropole by MIR. During MIR's 2009 demonstration, participants marched behind a banner that read, "If we are here, it is only because you were over there." It's a kind of slogan that's been, that's another footnote, it's the kind of slogan that was heard in Britain in the 1960s and 70s by quite a few ethnic minorities, mostly black. In this way, the march plays on the metropolitanism and republicanness of the space that it occupies and transforms by underscoring the here. In fact, in introducing the march by activating common French conceptions of here and there, MIR effectively stages the demonstration as a takeover, as the advent of the there to the here. A video of the 2009 demonstration shows marchers, for instance, singing the Algerian anthem and carrying portraits of Frantz Fanon, Muhammad Ali, and Mandela as Palestinian, Comorian, and Algerian flags fly overhead. They thereby rebaptize the space as indigenous and therefore modal. Similarly, during a May 2012 action, MIR members posted new street signs throughout Paris, renaming streets after Malcolm X, Cairo's Tahrir Square, and victims of French police brutality. These actions, referred to by MIR as baptisms, represent a concrete example of this type of spatial redemption. In the 2009 demonstration announcement, MIR identified its yearly march as, I quote, "the only national demonstration directly auto-organized by those who are treated by France as colonized subjects," unquote. As MI5, sorry. As MIR walks down the streets of Paris, creating an autonomous zone of solidarity and interest, they claim that space as indigenous and therefore open, thus realizing Houria Bouteldia's absolute space. The absolute space is a reference to a comment made by Bouteldia in a part of the article that I haven't read. Notably, MIR claims a space from which they are excluded. In this sense, the march in the metropole is significant as an assertion of mobility. It is worth noting that the 2009 video starts with a group of MIR members boarding a train to Paris. The trip to the center is thus a constitutive part of the demonstration. Moreover, because it mobilizes such a mass of bodies that by virtue of their sheer number resist the isolation required for arrest, the demonstration effectively renders the zone de non-droit, which is generally one phrase that is mobilized to refer to the banlieue, the zone de non-droit. So they render the zone de non-droit around the body of the indigène defensible. In this sense, it makes it an autonomous grouping of such bodies, and the protest acts as a defensible and mobile zone de non-droit. Like the train ride, this transient immunity from state discipline functions as resistance against ghettoization. Crucially, it also reflects the relationship between the space in question and the state. In his analysis of the protest of the 17th of October 1961, when approximately 30,000 Algerian migrants took to the streets of Paris in support of the FLN, only to be met with extreme police violence that claimed approximately 200 lives, Mr. Barkat argues, one of the key members of the MIR, argues that such peaceful groupings of indigène bodies effectively create spaces beyond state jurisdiction. He argues that such a grouping of bodies is based on a fundamental equality between people that radically transforms the indigène body, exploding the colonial conceptual framework. Because it does so without verbal political language, a discourse long ago invaded by colonial meanings and truth, this grouping of bodies, according to Barkat, speaks a new language, one of a body emancipating itself from the exception that instituted it, unquote. Barkat insists that this is more than a discursive or dialectic move, and represents, I quote, a unique manner of occupying territory and inscribing oneself in history, unquote. That creates a social space both functionally and conceptually outside the rule of law. In order for this to be the case, however, Barkat argues that the grouping of bodies must be peaceful and therefore outside the logic of power, constituting an effective escape from an encounter, confrontation, face-à-face with the police. So to conclude quite very briefly, in Twilight of Sovereignty or the Emergence of Cosmopolitan Norms, Sheila Ben-Habib notes that currently it is not only the center which flows to the periphery, but the periphery which flows towards the center, unquote. It is perhaps this fact that has generated French anxieties about metropolitan spatial purity that, as Yasmina has been trying to suggest in the paper, paradoxically provide the terrain to erect the kind of non-state space that Barkat describes, if we can allow that such a space is genuinely beyond the state, even if it occurs with express or tacit state consent, through permits, for instance, or the fact of police exercising restraint in order to cater to metropolitan opinion. In this sense, Barkat might argue that contemporary metropolitan political culture contains the seeds of its own undoing. A dedicated Schmittian, after Schmitt, would undoubtedly respond that this cannot be the case, at least not entirely, since the magic of the state is that it makes its own undoing its birth. It makes its own undoing its birth. If anything, the Mouvement des Indigènes de la République shows that as periphery moves to metropole, the colonial geography is not undoing itself, but reconfiguring itself. MIR does show us horizons of an undoing. The question that remains is how to enter them. Thank you.